Hi, this is Mr. Seymour, and this is going to be Chapter 13, which is going to talk about the executive branch of government. So we're going to be looking at the executive branch from the perspective of the federal bureaucracy. We've already looked at this unit from the perspective of the presidency in the last chapter, Chapter 12. So now it's time to look at the bureaucracy itself. So we're going to talk about bureaucracy and bureaucrats, how bureaucracies are organized, how bureaucracies implement policy, how they regulate policy, and then we're going to look at theories of bureaucracy as well. Max Weber, who's a political theorist, has identified a bureaucracy as having certain characteristics. The first is that it has a hierarchical authority structure. Now, a hierarchical authority structure means that you have levels and layers. So, what you've got generally is one box here, and then several other little boxes, and this is how you usually know that you have a hierarchy, because somebody reports to somebody else, and you have a downward structure of authority. Those at the top have more authority than those at the bottom, and it's also usually responsibility is supposed to be shared at the top, but oftentimes gets pushed down to the bottom. It uses a system of task specialization. So when you get into different layers, these guys report to these guys, report to this guy, and these guys have certain jobs. So each of them has a job to do. They operate on what's called the merit principle, and the merit principle basically is the idea that you get your job promotions by doing your job well. You should be hired on the basis of of the most qualifications. Those who are the most qualified should be up here at the top. That doesn't necessarily prove true. It also, a bureaucracy develops extensive rules. So as you go down the line of hierarchy, you will have rules and regulations, and the government is full of it, literally. Okay, and of course, we usually identify all of this as being red tape. Also, it behaves with impersonality. It's an entity of its own. It isn't necessarily the people. It becomes its own entity. Impersonal, full of red tape, full of regulations. No, you can't do that because the system is that way. That's what bureaucracies are all about. Now, there are some myths and realities about bureaucracies and bureaucrats. And we're going to look at two different levels. One is the civil servant level, which would be those that are hired based on merit using the civil service test. So these guys are hired based on the civil service test. These guys are hired based on something called the Plum Book. They are appointed. That's your political appointees. Myths and realities. Americans tend to dislike bureaucrats. Americans are generally satisfied with bureaucrats and the treatment that they get from them. So the fact that bureaucrats are bad or that Americans dislike bureaucrats is not true. Now, do Americans dislike bureaucracy? Oftentimes that is true. Bureaucracies are growing bigger each year, and that all the growth is state and local. 20 million state and local and 2.8 million federal workers, 2% of the workforce, 1.4 million federal military. So the majority of growth in bureaucracy is at the state and local level. Bureaucracies, though, are not necessarily growing bigger each year because the money there isn't there to afford the growth in bureaucracy, and the people don't support the growth in bureaucracy. Most federal bureaucrats work in Washington, D.C. That's not true. 12% of the 2.8 million federal civilian employees work in Washington. The rest are scattered all over the country and all over the world. All right, so Texas, for instance, has 124,000 federal workers. California, 153,000. Florida, 80,000. So all these states in blue have a lot of federal workers. The states in red have a lower number of federal workers. The states in green have a moderate number. The states in brown have not the lowest, but not the highest, certainly. Okay. You need to have federal employees. We rank like second or third in the country. Virginia is at 133,000, but that's because Washington, D.C. Has so many. So you have Virginia at 133,000, Washington, D.C. at 145,000, Maryland at 113,000. California has the highest number of federal workers in it at 153,000. Texas has 124,000. So we're like fourth or fifth. All right. Another myth: bureaucracies are ineffective, inefficient, and always mired in red tape. Government bureaucracies are not necessarily in and of themselves inefficient, ineffective, or mired in red tape, but policymakers can unintentionally create the red tape. And we're going to look at some of the things that cause bureaucracies not to work so efficiently. And it's usually in the design of the policy, not in the design of the bureaucracy. We have quite a number of executive departments. Defense and military functions have the highest number of employees at 708,000. The non-cabinet agency that has the most employees after that would be the post office. All right. So the Veterans Affairs Department has 279,000. Homeland Security, 176,000. Justice is 119,000. Treasury, 113,000. And Commerce, 141,000. But that includes 90,000 temporary workers for the census. $90,000 temporary workers for the census, so this is not accurate. Department of Education has only 4,300 workers. So we don't put a lot of faith, I guess, in hiring people in the education department. Non-cabinet agencies, Postal Service, 656,000. After that, the Social Security Administration, Army Corps of Engineers, NASA, EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, and the General Service Administration. Now, The old-fashioned way of hiring a civil employee would be patronage, which is basically you getting your job or your promotion for political purpose. What have you done for me? The Pendleton Civil Service Act of 1883 will create a federal civil service commission so that hiring and promotion would be based on merit. Civil service is hiring and promotion based on the merit and nonpartisan governmental service. You're not at the disposition of changing parties or changing leadership. So these are non-postal civilian workers. The average age of a non-postal civilian worker is about 47. 44% of them are college graduates, 56% are not. That's much higher than the regular population, where maybe 30% are college graduates. 56% are male, 44% female. 67% of civilian employees, non-postal, are white. 33% are minorities. So the merit principle says that you should get your job on the basis of an entrance exam and promotion ratings based on your work to get people with talent and skill. The Hatch Act of 1939 says that employees cannot participate in partisan politics while on duty. So if you're going to campaign for someone, you have to do it off duty. You cannot campaign for a candidate while you are on duty. The Office of Personnel Management was created in 1978, and it is responsible for hiring and firing most federal employees, and most federal agencies use these rules and this office to do their hiring and their. When you're a federal employee, you get a GS rating or a general service or general schedule rating. The schedule for federal employees range from GS1 to GS18. Salaries can be keyed to rating and experience within each of those schedule numbers. So you can start out anywhere from a GS1 to a GS8 and work your way up. Senior executive service are the 9,000 federal governmental managers that provide leadership at the top. This comes from the Plum book. The Plum book is a listing of the top federal jobs that are available for direct presidential appointment, with Senate confirmation usually. The 500 top policy-making posts, which are mostly cabinet secretaries, undersecretaries, and assistant secretaries, and bureau chiefs, and the 2,500 lesser positions. All of these policy-making posts require senatorial confirmation. So an incoming president will seek people who combine executive talent, political skills, and policy positions that are similar to his, so that he can set up his policy agenda. Incoming presidents also try to ensure diversity and balance with regard to gender, ethnicity, religion, and party. But they are going to seek people who they know will support their position and are loyal. Now, those are the people they will appoint. Okay, these are the Plum Book positions. When it comes to civil service, all of these rules are out because it's all on merit. So, organization. The federal government is organized into cabinet departments, which are your executive departments. We also have independent regulatory commissions, government corporations, and independent executive agencies. This is basically the organization of the federal government with the president and the chief executive office at the top. You have these departments in brown are the ones that were created, basically, when we created the government. These departments in green came later. The departments in purple came even after that. So you have the Department of State, Department of Treasury, Department of Defense, and Department of Justice. The Department of Defense was not called the Defense Department at the time. It was called the War Department. Department of the Interior, Department which deals with national parks and government land, Department of Agriculture, Department of Commerce, Department of Labor, Department of Transportation. Then you have Housing and Urban Development, Health and Human Services, Energy, Education, Veterans Affairs, and Homeland Security. Homeland Security is the newest of these. Then we also have our independent agencies and government corporations. So all of these are independent agencies and government corporations. They are not directly connected to the executive department, but they are under their purview. So cabinet departments. Each department manages specific policy areas. It has its own budget and its own staff. Each department has a mission and it's organized differently. Bureaus, which are sometimes they are called an administration or a service or an office, are allowed to divide work into specialized areas. These are your specialty areas. Independent regulatory commissions are government agencies responsible for making legislative and enforcing rules. So they make and enforce rules to protect the public interest. So the Food and Drug Administration, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration are examples. The Environmental Protection Administration, they're supposed to be there for public interest and in some sector of the economy and for judging judicial disputes over rules. So an example would be a Federal Reserve Board. These are regulatory. EPA is regulatory. FDA is also regulatory. All right, government organizations that provide a service that could be provided by private sectors and typically charge for their services are government corporations. Largest government corporation is the U.S. Mail. You cannot buy stock, and you cannot collect dividends from a public corporation because the sole owner is the U.S. government. An example, Postal Service. So now let's look at implementation. The idea of the executive branch is to implement and oversee policy. These are not policy makers, but policy implementers. They execute the policy. Why do sometimes the best laid plans fail? And what is privatization? I think right now, with regard to Obamacare, there are some things happening right now that are causing us to, a lot of people to have second thoughts about whether or not we got what we thought we were getting. And if that's the case, then it's obvious that the Republicans may win in the situation of removing Obamacare. But if it's just a shakeout period, then we will go through the process of implementation. Implementation is the stage of policy making that happens from the time that a policy is established to the time that it gets affected by people. This is when we put it into place. It involves translating the goals and objectives of the policy into an operating, ongoing program within the confines of the law. There are three elements of implementation. You have to create an agency and assign new responsibility. You have to translate policy goals into operational rules. So you have the translate phase. And then you coordinate the resources and personnel to achieve the goals. At any of these stages, you're going to have problems, and you're going to need to do a shakedown. But if you continuously have problems and the policy is bad, this is where it shows up. Hopefully before we can get to the negative consequences, but sometimes that can. Your program design, if a program fails, oftentimes it's because it was designed improperly. It's impossible to implement a policy or a program well that is defective in its theoretical conception. And this is where right now we're having a debate over Obamacare. Is the idea that you're going to have this mid-level, everybody's going to go out and get private insurance, but it's got to have certain things in it. Is this a good idea? Some people who have been carrying low-cost insurance that wasn't providing all of the things that Obamacare is supposed to provide are finding that their rates are going up 500-600%. Why? Because they were carrying $25, $30 a month insurance policies, thinking, oh, well, that'll at least cover me a little bit. Well, it wasn't covering them. And so now they're having to buy real insurance policies, and those things are very, very expensive. Lack of clarity. Bureaucracies are often asked to implement unclear laws. Congress can escape the messy details. For example, Title IX of the Education Act of 1972 was unclear, making implementation complex. But it was fixed. So Title IX is the part that says that women have to get equal representation in sports, in college sports, and high school sports, just as much as the men do. And when they decided to prevent gender discrimination in college athletics, it left bureaucrats the task of creating guidelines. And so we've had to go through a shakedown period. But now there's no one in college athletics that doesn't acknowledge that Title IX has worked. Another reason why you have failure with regard to implementation is that you have a lack of resources. Bureaucracies can lack the staff necessary, the training, the funding, the supplies, the equipment, or the authority to carry out the tasks that they've been assigned to do. Unfunded mandates, laws that require certain things from the government without providing the resources or the budget or the authority. Standard operating procedures, or SOPs, are your administrative routines. They bring efficiency and uniformity to everyday decision making, but they also cause red tape. This is the system. Routines become frustrating. Red tape or potentially dangerous obstacles to action when not appropriate to a situation. So you need to be able to make decisions on the fly, and that means empowering your employees with some level of authority. All right, another is the dispositions of the administrators. A bureaucrat uses administrative discretion to select from responses to a given problem. Street-level bureaucrats are in constant contact with the public. They're supposed to have discretion. This is empowerment. However, if they don't have discretion or authority, then this becomes a problem. If they don't want to use their authority, or they're just being real, what's a good word? Fuddy-duddies, I guess, would be a appropriate word. Basically, they stick by the rules and they don't use their heads. This is where red tape can be a problem. So these are Border Patrol officers arresting undocumented immigrants on the U.S.-Mexico border. They need to decide who that they will search and who they will let pass very quickly with a quick check. They have to be empowered. Fragmentation is where you divide up the responsibility for a policy among a number of units within the bureaucracy and don't give anybody authority to oversee or implement. It makes coordination time-consuming and difficult. It produces contradictory signals among the agencies, and it usually leads to failure. So that is fragmentation. Private contractors have become almost a fourth branch of government. We're going to talk about iron triangles here in just a little bit. They contract for services. The theory is that private sector competition will result in better service at lower costs. but no evidence has proven this. Contracting leads to less public scrutiny as programs are hidden. And if you don't know what an iron triangle is, it is the relationship between a policymaker, a bureaucratic entity, and a special interest or a contractor. So what they do is they're so tight you can't break the bonds, because the contractor wants the money, the contract. The agency needs the services the contractor's providing, and the policymakers want to get reelected. And they all end up working together. Regulation is the use of governmental authority to control or change some practice in the private sector. Congress gives bureaucrats a broad mandate to regulate activities as diverse as interest rates, the location of a nuclear power plant, and food additives. So this is regulatory discretion. With regard to regulation, you can see using the Federal Register that, for instance, President Reagan took down regulation. Under George Bush, George H.W., it kind of stayed the same. Under Clinton, it kind of went up. Under Bush, he took it down a little bit, but then it went back up again. Obama is actually trying to deregulate a little bit. So you can look at the trend line. Usually Republicans promise to deregulate, but they don't always achieve their promises. Democrats are no more for regulation than Republicans are. So we want to look at economic regulation and everyday life regulation, and then the policies of action. So in Munn versus Illinois in 1877, the right of government to regulate businesses is affirmed. The Interstate Commerce Commission in 1887 is created, and it is the first regulatory agency. It regulates railroads, their prices, and their services to farmers. That's the Interstate Commerce Commission. Today. Command and control policy, which is when the government tells business how to reach certain goals, checks that these commands are followed, and punishes offenders. This is the stick. Incentives, this is the stick here. Incentives are market strategies such as rewards that are used to manage public policy. This is the carrot. So there are three elements of regulation. First is a grant of power and a set of directions from Congress. Second is a set of rules and guidelines by the agency itself. Third is a means of enforcing and compliance. You can make all the rules in the world, but if you can't enforce them, they will do no good. Deregulation means lifting government restrictions on business, industry, or professional activities. And there are critics of regulation who say that it distorts market forces, that it causes prices to be unusually high, that it hurts competitiveness abroad, and it fails to work well. But also deregulation, people take advantage and they do gouging. The critics of deregulation point out that deregulation does not protect the public against environmental damage, power shortages, failures in the savings and loan industry, and bursts in real estate market. So we have lots of anecdotal evidence to say that deregulation has not worked so well. So now we're going to understand bureaucracies themselves. We're going to look at bureaucracy and democracy, and then bureaucracy and the scope of government. With regard to bureaucracy and democracy, popular control of government depends on elections. But we do not elect the 4.2 million federal employees. They go through, most of them, the civil service program, and then they stay. The fact that voters don't elect civil servants does not mean that the bureaucracies cannot respond well to or represent the public's interests. It just means they have to be able to do it by way of their authority and by way of empowerment. So, presidential control. Methods of control of the bureaucracy are to appoint the right people to the head of the agency, to issue executive orders, which basically say you will do what I say, and they don't need to be approved by Congress. to alter an agency's budget, either give them more or less money, and to reorganize the agency. We saw this happen with Homeland Security. We took several agencies and organized them into one. Okay. For Congress, the methods are to influence appointment of agency heads, to alter the budget, to hold hearings, which are called oversight, and to rewrite the rules to make them more detailed or less detailed. Now, this is where we get into our iron triangles. Iron triangles are basically sub-governments. They are mutually dependent and advantageous relationships that happen between a bureaucratic agency, an interest group, and congressional committees or subcommittees. They dominate some area of domestic policy making, particularly defense. If the Navy wants to get a new fighter jet, they're going to have to work with the lobbies and or the contractors for that fighter jet. The lobbyists will, on behalf of the contractors, influence Congress. So you end up with a very tight iron triangle. So this is your iron triangle. So this is the tobacco division of the Department of Agriculture that's working with interest groups for tobacco. The tobacco companies, the farmers, and the manufacturers. Your subcommittees over here are also working with the rules, and so you have interaction. So the bureaucracy, the rulings on tobacco production and prices come from the bureaucracy to the interest groups, but then they also come, the interest group give them information and they give them support for budget requests. So they say, we'll fight for you. The interest groups over here are working with the subcommittees, back and forth. Then over here for the subcommittees, they're working with the bureaucracy and funding it. And so what you end up with is a very tight iron triangle. They're composed of bureaucratic agencies, interest groups, and congressional committees or subcommittees that have dominated some areas of domestic policy making by combining internal consensus with a virtual monopoly on information. Tobacco triangle is one example. There are dozens more iron triangles that are characterized by mutual dependency. This is one characteristic. Mutual dependency. Each element provides key services, information, or policy to the others. These arrows indicate those mutual relationships. So it's all about mutual relationships. And there's a lot of people that say, well, the reason that we're even allowing tobacco to be made today is because of these iron triangles. The gun industry, you could find that. The defense industry is where you find the most. Issue networks have led more widespread participation in bureaucratic policymaking. These are participants who have technical policy expertise and are drawn to those areas because of their intellectual or emotional commitments. These are basically think tanks. But they also have a lot of dominance in the area. These are the guys who know policy or they know. Okay, as far as the scope of government, the size of the bureaucracy has actually shrunken compared to the labor force. Agencies don't necessarily get all the resources they need to do what they're expected to do. Bureaucracies are supposed to carry out the policies, but Congress and the President decide what the government does, so that often leaves the bureaucracy in a state where their hands. Bureaucrats have to perform vital services, and the federal government provides these services, but their number has not grown. Even as the population has increased, the public has made additional demands on government, which means that government workers are very overburdened. Bureaucrats shape policy as administrators, as implementers, and as regulators. So there's the administration, implementation, and regulation. Most federal bureaucrats get their jobs through civil service. Most of them do. As a group, these are broadly representative of the American people. But the top policy-making posts are filled through appointments, often by Senate confirmation, plum book. Independent regulatory commissions make and enforce rules on particular sectors of the economy. Government corporations provide services and charge for those services. Independent executive agencies will account for most of the rest of the federal bureaucracy. The resources available for implementation, the ability of administrators to depart from SOPs, their empowerment levels, and the disposition of administrators towards the policy that they implement influence the effectiveness of policy implementation. So we have to empower. I think that's the key here. The extent to which the responsibility for policy is concentration rather than dispersion influences effectiveness. Okay? This is where you get into fragmentation. Congress is increasingly delegating large amounts of power to bureaucratic agencies to develop rules to regulate practices in the private sector. Agencies apply and enforce those rules in court or through administrative procedures. These are your regulatory agencies. And that's pretty much the end of this chapter. The main thing is that you need to take away from this is exactly what a bureaucracy is, what red tape is, and the problems of implementation.